I thought, so we're in Division Two. Woohoo! When I was in grad school, we were this course I took on Carnap and Heidegger. We were supposed to get through the whole thing. We only got through Division One, and I understood like not a word of even of Division One, but we never even tried Division Two. So this is completely new territory for me. Um, so I don't know. I thought a helpful question to start, and I have this feeling that the answer's somewhere near the beginning of Division One, and I started to go back and look by using the index, but I didn't get very far. But anyway, he says, in the beginning of this Division Two, what he's what he's looking for is a primordial ontological interpretation. And I guess I'm not sure whether to say of Dasein or being, because he wants to know what is the meaning of being in general. But on right at the very end of Heidegger 231, which is the top of the Stambau 222, he says, what then do we mean by the primordiality of an ontological interpretation? And so I thought might be useful just to talk about what he means by primordiality. And again, maybe he's already answered that. I mean, my gut feeling is it's something like transcendental, primordial in the sense of the conditions for the possibility of, but instead of, for Kant, the transcendental are the conditions for the possibility of this kind of experience and knowledge. And here it's the conditions for the possibility of these kinds of being, but I'm not sure. Anyway, does anyone have a better sense of what he means by primordial? And another thing I wanted to point out is because we talked about this earlier in the when we started this, that the notion of primordiality to me it seems to imply that he thinks that there is a, and this is I'm sure, a very non-Heideggerian word, but something like a universal ground for Dasein as such, and that it is primordial. And if you can find this primordial ground, then you have found the, the sort of ultimate ground of being for life, for Dasein and everything else. But then people were saying, and I don't know the later Heidegger at all, that later he kind of backs away from that notion of there being a unified, a historical ground of being, but then it becomes sort of historically relativized. But I kind of, I mean, I don't know that I want to talk about that too much because that would probably get us talking about things that are later in Heidegger. But I'm wondering if this notion of primordiality is kind of counter to that idea of there being a relativity to being, because when primordial to me just sounds like fundamental, like close to something like absolute. So I guess if I have questions, what do you think he means by primordial?
Maybe we can dive in a little bit of the last section too in asking that question, because like what I found interesting catching back up through section 44, 45 is that um there's this like component on the standby of like page 209 where he says and this is what section is this? This is the disclosedness and the disclosedness, Dasein, and truth, where he says that, let's see, middle of the page, right next to 218, nothing else that this being is, the very being that was meant in the statement, what comes to be demonstrated is that the expressive being is toward that which has been spoken about, is a pointing out of being that it reveals, the being towards which it is. And it it seems like he's shifting truth from this object perceiver component and making it something what's sort of, he's making it less static. It's like truth is an aspect of being that is revealing. So he's making truth a phenomenon that is part of the existential, I'm going to say this wrong, existential analytica that that lets you express who you uniquely are when it comes to revealing truth. It's something that is experienced. It's something that you express in Dasein in the ontological aspect. So if I had to guess what he means by to relate it to your formal question when it comes to primordial, is that he's trying to show or allow a thought process of becoming what's the word I'm looking for? An aspect of expressing your unique sense of Dasein in a way that is not an adherence to a rigid thought system of like object and knower. Like I think for him, primordial means being able through language and projects and differentiating between objects at hand and presence at hand, and the existential or the ontological and the ontic of being able to express who you are in that moment, like of allowing your authentic self to be revealed in such a way that he's describing it from a phenomena standpoint. So I think I think truth as phenomena would be what I would call primordial for Heidegger, is being able to engage in that and express your being rather than having it shift into this um what's the word, like purely ontological understanding of what it means to be human, at least. And I was curious what y'all thought about that when it comes to truth as phenomenon. Or did anybody else get that reading of the primordial? I don't know.
I don't know about primordial. My sense of the truth is truth has to do with things disclosing themselves as they disclosing themselves in themselves, something like that. Um, so the traditional notion of truth that he discusses is, truth is um, a property of declarative sentences or judgments. Truth is a property of judgment. So you make a judgment, you make a statement, and then that statement is either true or false. And so truth is something that it's a judgment is true or false. And a judgment, correct me if I'm wrong, guys, but then a judgment can generally be expressed usually as a declarative statement. And then you assign that a truth value, to use, the contemporary language. And I think he ties this all the way back to Aristotle, but you see it all the way through the philosophical tradition. And he's in that section, he's trying to, I guess, give a more primordial interpretation of truth and show that traditional notion of truth is derivative, I think he would say, from this more primordial notion of truth, which I thought, again, guys, I'd be happy to hear what you say, that ultimately truth was something like the disclosure of beings in themselves, or something like that, the disclosure of the things. Truth is disclosure.
Well, yeah, disclosure and like the interpretation of the existential self as the foundation of truth is how I took it.
Well, I don't know how much it's about the self and how much of it is the disclosure of beings. Go ahead, Chase. Sorry.
I was going to say, well, I think when Joseph's talking about the disclosure of the self, that for Heidegger is like a specific function of truth and a more ontological function of truth rather than ontical, I think, um, which reveals, I think you're right. I think that, the direction of the conversation, if we're asking, what's, the primordial ground for these later phenomena, and then looking back at how he discusses truth, right? Like so many other topics he takes up in this book. He's trying to do what's, a fundamental ontology. And this account of truth, by my reading, he's differing from the tradition by trying to give a fundamental ontology of truth. What is truth? Even before we can talk about agreement, between a proposition and a state of affairs. Even before we get to that, what is truth in itself, right? And it is an answer kind of like, what we've alluded to here, disclosing. Although for me, I mean, yeah, disclosing. And I think one of the things to take out of that is it's characterized as a kind of activity and not a thing, a reified thing, right? But an activity. But for me, like, again, I think I mentioned this last week, but I took Heidegger to be putting the locus of truth like in Dasein's being in the world. And so it's not the phenomena disclosing itself, but phenomena disclosing to Dasein. And without Dasein, there is no meaning or purpose to use the word truth, right? Things don't reveal themselves in their existential character except to Dasein, right? So this meaning of truth and disclosing is really only applicable to the really, again, a relationship between Dasein and the world. Not
Although I'm wondering if he would say, that even still is maybe too dualistic or too, so like revealing to Dasein sounds like Dasein's a subject. And so I'm thinking like Dasein is that being in which beings are is the Dasein is it's there. And so Dasein is, and I want to use the word clearing here, but I don't know how to use it, so I'm not going to. But that Dasein is the being that makes it possible for beings to disclose themselves. And so you could say Dasein. I mean, again, because I tend to think like it's this sort of ontological notion of intentionality. So for someone like Husserl, you say, well, there is no consciousness without an object, and to talk about consciousness without an object is nonsensical, although it turns out there are non-intentional modes of consciousness, but I don't know that he ever deals with that. But I think of Dasein as being the ontological version of that you don't have beings without Dasein, but also you don't have Dasein without beings. And so Dasein is the being through which or in the experience of which beings can disclose themselves. And so, I think, maybe I'm putting too much stress on that, but it's not like I don't think it's like beings disclose themselves to Dasein. It's that Dasein is sort of the field in which the beings can appear, can emerge, can disclose themselves as what they are.
Yeah, the truth exists in a mode of Dasein. He puts it in the existential analytic. I read that as well. Like it's like truth exists in a mode of Dasein.
Yeah. Doesn't he say the locus of truth is in Dasein? Specifically a mode of Dasein's being. That's the locus of truth, I believe. Which I think he is um somewhat critical of that, the later Heidegger, where put he wants to give being more of the agency, um, where Dasein, I think, is more passive I guess, but I'm not really sure. But I think for the so what I wrote about phenomena, so the Greek middle voice would be this kind of self-reflexive thing for phenomena. So the verb, it's like the phenomenon or whatnot. It would be the phenomena shows itself of itself. So it has this kind of, it's both the active agent, but of itself passively. So it has this kind of circularity that makes it where it doesn't have any kind of clear, you got one active subject here, one passive subject here that receives the action. So I think by doing that, he's kind of pointing out, yeah, there is some kind of autonomy for phenomena, but indeed it can't be this autonomy or anything, any kind of showing of itself. Is it if you don't have Dasein, because that's who it's showing itself to. So there's always, yeah, Dasein always has to be involved within that phenomena. And that's his transcendental idealism, essentially. Um,
It's so cool too, because it's like he hasn't rejected correspondence theory or intuitionism entirely. He said it's like a
Derivative.
yes, a derivative. He says it's a derivative, but by placing truth in the existential, I'm saying wrong, existentia analytica, he is making it open for you to authentically experience what it means to be. He has made it so that in his system, it's not rejecting those other forms of ontology, but he has not allowed his philosophy to strip you from being able to express what your design is to others. And that's really cool. Like
Yeah.
that to me is like that's like the Final Fantasy 7 da 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 music for this text. Like that is really significant.
But I think he would say those earlier views are still they're missing something. So it's not. I don't think he's saying, yeah, here's just another thing, and that mine's as good as theirs. I think he's saying his is more fundamental or more primordial, and by
Well,
saying that theirs are
yeah,
derivative, he's implying that that they did miss something fundamental.
yeah, I agree with you. And that to get back to your primordiality, that it's not saying it's like as good, but this system kind of opens up philosophy to you to experience genuine being and express it in ways that previously had closed it off, kind of robbed you of that primordiality of what it means to experience and communicate your design.
Ed, were you gonna? Oh,
Um, so yeah, in regards to the question of primordiality, so the thing that he emphasizes is that primordiality requires some kind of a wholeness as kind of his key word in which he sees it. That's why he's goes into this investigation of death, being towards death. He sees that as establishing the end of Dasein that enables it to be understood as a whole, and that is the primordiality. Although
but
I don't understand exactly why that connection of primordiality and necessarily why that requires a whole in the way that he's thinking, other than it's probably something. So the way that he talks about phenomena is that you can't split the phenomena. That would be this mischaracterization of it that makes it where it's no longer even phenomena if you're breaking it up. So I think the way that he thinks of it is you need some for his existential interpretation. So that's the other thing, is that what needs to be characterized as primordial is an existential interpretation of Dasein. And he, on the, what is it, H232, he kind of goes into some of the details about that as an interpretation, although it gets very complicated very quickly, and I don't uh definitely do not understand all of this. But I think what he's trying to do is he wants to have an existential analysis that gives an explicit concept for this interpretation that he has. And the interpretation needs some kind of a phenomena to go along with it. And that phenomena has to be whole. It can't be split apart. So the question is kind of what phenomena reveals Dasein in its wholeness, which would be also its temporality in terms of past, present, future. And he's going to basically say it's death in a very special way that is still kind of coming up. Is he still establishing the basis for his positive concept of death, which will be the readings for next week more so.
And
Yeah.
it seems like he's saying like this is not a shift. Like this isn't a shift from the existential analytic to ontology. This is not something that is like if then mode. They're entwined, it seems. Like that he almost seems to look at temporality or time from an ontic perspective as perspective. But there's this existential aspect where if truth is in Dasein and it's disclosing itself, it is rooted in the existential. So I'm curious to see where he goes with it, because it seems like he's saying there's almost, dare I say, dialectical relationship between the two, and that there's not this we have done the existential analytic and now we can move on to the ontic, which is death. He seems to suggest, at least in the reading, that they're tied together in the disclosedness of truth as phenomena, and that there's a component of being in time as a perspective of finality that gives its significance, and that comes from that perspective.
Matthew Squires sent me a link to here a day or two ago to the first Gifford lecture by
Cornell West.
Yeah, by Cornell West. And I just thought it was funny in that, you know, he's one of these guys, Cornell West, that has this vast, you know, vast understanding of the tradition. And, you know, he's quoting from Aristotle and from Stoics and what's, but anyway, he starts talking about death and the importance of death. And he goes, and I'm not talking about Heidegger's kind of death. I'm talking about dead people, dead bodies on the ground. And I just thought that was sort of funny. You see, I'm not talking about ontic death. I am talking about ontic death, I think is what he would say. Not death as some existential structure or something.
But isn't that interesting how the dead bodies on the ground can like impact those expressions of Dasein as they disclose the truth, like the actual ending of another being, particularly like with how you react to it, because their ontic aspect is over. But how does that affect you when you are expressing truth as a phenomenon? Like that's a fascinating thing, because even in the Heideggerian sense of seeing dead bodies on the ground, it's still going to impact us and how we express Dasein in that moment. So there's still an existential component to it. And that's where he seems to have this dialectical relate. It's like he's putting fields of demarcation on certain things, but saying we can't escape this because Dasein fundamentally, as a phenomenon of truth, that it is if truth is in Dasein and it's always being revealed in Dasein, it's fundamentally a human condition. And even in that finality of death, it's going to impact others, like how we react to seeing those corpses on the ground, what that does to us and our society at the time.
But I think that's still mostly in the domain of ontic. I think, and again, like Chase was saying, we're going to get to this here shortly, and I haven't read this before, so I don't know where it's headed. But he wants to explain death as a structural feature of Dasein, which I think would then make possible our I don't know how, I don't want to use the word everyday because it has that special meaning for him. But our experience, the way we experience death in an ontic way is possible because of the ontological, implications of death. So that's why I say there's sort of transcendental thing. There's this whatever this death is that he's talking about it seems to me it is the condition for the possibility of the way we experience death in an ontic way. Does that sound right? Ish. I was going to say, I'm sorry I'm talking so much, but I was going to say about the primordiality. He talks about primordiality a whole lot in the first section, the division 1, but he doesn't bring up the wholeness thing until here. And so the sense that I got was he was saying earlier, I'm trying to find a primordial, I don't know what, a primordial explication of Dasein. And that's what I'm trying to do here. Then when he gets to with the division 2, he's like, yeah, that's what I want to do. But as it turns out, you can't have a primordial description, a primordial explication, unless it's whole. And so it's like, because I don't remember him emphasizing the wholeness earlier. It's like now he gets here and he says, well, we've been looking for this primordial whatever. Can we get there? And he's like, well, actually, we don't have that. I was trying to give a primordial explanation earlier, but now, if we look at this notion, the fact that all I've talked about is inauthenticity, I haven't talked about authenticity in a positive sense, and I haven't talked about what gives Dasein a wholeness. And so now, as it turns out, we don't have a primordial explanation of Dasein because it lacks these fundamental features. So he talked about primordiality prior to getting to this notion of wholeness, but now he's sort of admitting you can't get there unless you include this wholeness.
Oh, to that, I was gonna say, like, it struck me, and I mean, it might be early on here in Division 2, but a lot of Division 1 seems to be playing in a Kantian key. And it seems like there's been a modulation, and we're now borrowing more from Hegelian themes. This emphasis on wholeness, and now being towards nothing. It's not quite Hegel, you know what I mean? But being vanishing into nothingness, which is where we get determinate being or becoming and then determinate being. Is to my mind, much of this next division is going to, is drawing from the science of logic.
Where's Hunter? 'Cause I don't get science of logic other than being, non-being, becoming. After that, I've lost track. There's also something about essence in there, right?
Yeah.
And yeah.
Yeah, there's 3 divisions, right? But the first division, the doctrine of being, takes up temporality. And it seems to me, okay, it seems to me like one of the things that Hegel's trying to discuss with regard to temporality as such is that You know, in order to get to temporality, we have to pass through both finity and infinitude, you know, to get a grasp of what these are, to really get to actually get a grasp of temporality. Again, how do we understand temporality except through a kind of finitude mediated by infinitude, you know? And I think this is something of what Heidegger is kind of exploring here is the finitude of temporality, really emphasizing the finitude.
So I know that at the very end of this book, I think it's literally the last section or the second to last section is on Hegel's conception of time. And I think he's mainly critical of it, which doesn't mean, of course, that he's not taking elements of it. I think he probably is. Although I'm just too ignorant to really be able to tell what that is. But I think that emphasis on finitude is definitely important for Heidegger. And also, I mean, in general, the post-Kantian or in Kantian too is
Right.
okay. I think, as far as I know, sort of the dogmatic rationalists, they had this. I mean, you think of Leibniz, Spinoza with the multiple types of infinity, which is a pretty common thing. Actual infinity, absolute infinity. They had all these, species of infinities. And then Kant was quite critical of that and said emphasized finitude. And then the post-Kantians are going to kind of play between those, um, somewhat bringing back uh, infinity or infinitude with in relation to finitude. And I think that's definitely what Hegel is doing too, and probably Heidegger as well.
And you have those damn analytics with finite constructivism. Hate those guys.
Yeah, yeah. Screw them. Yeah. I know one thing. Let's get my bingo card out of the way. Uh, so one book I was reading was emphasizing that Deleuze's conception of time and difference repetition. So he's getting a lot from Husserl and Heidegger and Heidegger's reading of Kant, um, where Heidegger emphasizes the temporal aspect of the syntheses of Kant's syntheses. But one thing that this author was stressing was that Deleuze rejects the finitude idea, or specifically the distinction that kind of a binary between finitude and infinitude. But I don't know enough about it to assess that one way or another. But it seems like there's something definitely going on with this whole milieu of philosophy with between infinitude and finitude, and Heidegger wants to emphasize finitude. But once again, I just don't know if about Hegel or even really Kant really to be able to assess what's going on. But I think that's the death is, and also as a whole and as an end and as a totality, this emphasis, I think that is very much part of this conception of temporality as finitude. But I guess we'll have to see exactly how that works, because I don't know.
One thing that made a lot of sense to me, just on a real simple level, was all along he's been talking about Dasein. I've forgotten again. I'm going to probably say it incorrectly, but is its possibilities or something like that. And so, Dasein is possibilities. um, but and so I kept wondering, well, what the hell does that mean? I mean, because it just sounds like Dasein is kind of empty, because it's just possibilities, possibilities, possibilities. Like, does anything ever happen? And he kind of makes that point here that, well, yeah, that's a good point. Dasein is just this kind of open-ended project. And how could you, how could you ever say that Dasein is when it's always becoming, when it's always an open-ended project? And so you can't really say what Dasein is until the project closes. And that just on a real simple level made sense to me.
Yeah, so it's gonna get worse on that. The reading for next time, and then I think uh the one after that too, kind of the rest of this chapter that's focusing on being towards death, being a whole. Dasein's possibility of being a whole and being towards death. Uh it's gonna get way more possible going on. Um is so the part I haven't this part of it I haven't read before, but the part coming up is what was in the actual assignment in Alistair's 20th century continental class. And that's where he really gets into his positive conception of death, which is very much related to possibilities becomes this individuating thing. So, but we'll get to that. There's something else I was gonna say. I can't remember though. Whatever.
I posted that passage on Discord from Aristotle, and like I said in that, I don't really claim that there's a huge, that Heidegger's riffing on Aristotle, but it is interestingly a similar point. Aristotle, because he says that a happy life, happiness is the most complete because there isn't anything beyond it. So happiness is the only complete good or whatever, but you can't know that that you had a happy life until it's over, because how do you know? You can't assess the totality of a life until you can see the whole life completed. And so at least it has there's a similarity there. You can't assess life until you can see the whole thing. But then he raises these, which I just find hilarious things. Yeah, but then what happens if your kids are real screwballs, and because your kids are your legacy, and so they're going to have an effect on what your life, the meaning of your life, because they're going to, what they do is going to reflect on you. So then maybe after you're dead, your kids are going to really screw things up and make you unhappy, even though you're already dead, which I just find hilarious. But at least there's the similarity of the thing needs to be complete in some sense.
I was reminded in reverse because I hadn't read this section of Nicomachean Ethics until after I'd read Being and Time. So when I read Aristotle, I was like, oh, I remember there's something in Heidegger, and it seems a bit odd. It seems like a bit of an odd kind of perspective to take about, well, we're like, first off, just the idea that we're going to evaluate lives as kind of like distinct quanta. You know what I mean? With a clear beginning, clear end, But then, part of Aristotle's idea is to kind of to muddy that a bit, right? It's not quite so clear when it ends. And so can you ever say you've had a happy life? Some tragedy may befall you right at the end, and it will have all been a miserable life because of that tragedy. And then the thought occurs to me, right? What if you have had the pleasure of experiencing that one joy that would ask, you would say, let this moment tarry, forever, and if I could just live in this moment of bliss for, eternity, but the fact I get to enjoy this moment in itself justifies, any tortures or tragedies or hell, my soul being dragged to that, burning pits of hell, it would be fine. It would be justified because of this moment. of fulfillment and pleasure that I'm experiencing. I don't know, just a thought.
I
Is
mean,
that
the kind of
Faustian?
Helen of Troy moment with Faust there.
Yeah. So the Aristotle thing, I think is definitely, I think he's responding to that, and he's taking some elements of it, but I think he's ultimately arguing against it based off that he has this different conception of death as compared to a kind of um let's see. So one thing he says is that if for the reason that your biological death doesn't work as a kind of ending state that defines you as a your life as a whole would be that uh once you're dead, Dasein no longer is. So it's not Dasein anymore. Which is why he wants to say that death has to be this mode of being that corresponds to Dasein while it's existing, because that's the only thing it can only be a mode of it can only be Dasein if it's existing or alive. Although he doesn't like talking about things. It doesn't like life necessarily as a word, but yeah,
Well, it's interesting you say that because if truth is disclosedness and truth is in Dasein, and the they self always tries to avoid the ontological question, right? Like the they self doesn't want to have the ontological question.
or it just assumes that it knows it already.
Yeah, okay, yeah, or assumes that the they self doesn't die. It's essentially it never experiences death. It's like this component of we're always the death of the person disclosing the truth to them that they have encountered and as phenomena that they are showing themselves to be. Death exposes the authenticity of that. It that's kind of neat. Like I never thought of it that way.
Yeah, in the I think it's section 50 or so, he'll talk about the everyday discourse of death, essentially the they self's interpretation of death, where it's this kind of obvious fact, but it's always something in the future, not yet. I'll deal with it when it happens. And it's so we understand it already as a fact. Of course, everyone dies. Everybody knows that. But I'm not going to die for a long time, so who cares? Um, I don't need to worry about that. That's kind of his take on that. But then there's also there's one aspect of a kind of death denial sort of thing going on, and that it accepts it as this superficial fact that doesn't really matter. Um, but also sees it as something that I think one of the things that he's making this point is that um, we have conceptualized the death of Dasein as something like the annihilation of something present at hand. We've only really considered it as something like that, or as something from the perspective of a fact that others can be aware of. So the death of others, some other can die. Like, oh yeah, the guy's dead. Okay. But it's seen as some kind of a fact with this distinct historical time period of like a before and after that once again that doesn't really get to the key point that it's about a mode of being during your existence visit or of your existence. That's what he really wants to emphasize.
And hopefully he's going to explain what that means coming up, I hope. Because right now I don't really have a sense of what is being toward death as a way of being. I don't really have a sense for what that means. So tell me he's going to explain this.
I
We'll understand
presumably.
small fraction possibly of it. I don't know. I won't.
So, okay, if I want to, I'm going to give a very rough answer for it, trying to give a sort of a prevision of what Heidegger hopefully will explain better than I'm going to attempt to. So death as a mode of your being would be your death is the possibility of your impossibility of being. So that marks your end, but also it's only your possibility because nobody can die. I think people can die for other people as representatives, but never really. Um, there's something about death that can't be represented or substituted or replaceable. So it's individuating in that aspect. So the way that you relate to your death as your own death is this individuation, and it's individuation of your own possibilities. So that is the aspect in which, and this is also what authenticity is about, in which you're grasping your own possibilities as demarcated by this being towards the possibility of your death, which is the end of your possibilities. So through that, you're individuated in this authentic manner that he's talking about. But it's this orientation towards your own authentic possibilities, which is your being. And maybe that's too much Heideggerian jargon, but that's probably the best way I could explain it.
That's a good way to put it. It kind of wraps up care and dread, and it does lead an emphasis on the component of death being an ontological basis for human existence. Without that temporality, there would be no turning away. Without that turning away, there'd be no dread, and without that dread, there'd be no care. It's really fascinating.
Yeah, he's gonna add those components to it, definitely. That's what that angst, anxiety, dread, it's going to be um that's what this being towards death is about. They're basically the same thing, I think he says.
So is this then also related to thrownness? Because when you were talking about the the death sort of seems to reveal a sort of arbitrary nature to my existence. I didn't have to exist. I happened to exist, but that was just sort of an accident of the way things worked out. And so it seems like, the fact of death, I don't know. Maybe I'm putting too many together, but it just seems like it kind of fits with this notion of thrownness. The fact of my death is just another not aspect of, but it's related to this notion of sort of thrownness or the arbitrariness of any particular life.
Yeah, I think it definitely is. You're thrown into your own most possibilities. And that's what's revealed with anxiety, is that you have this potential to either kind of grasp those authentic possibilities or to go into inauthentic public interpretation that limits your possibilities according to a generic way rather than the way that is individuated according to you but that you is exactly your thrownness. That's your past that you've been thrown into, which is indeed this kind of, on one level, a kind of, you've got contingent facticity elements to go along with that. And that's what also makes it your individuated being or possibility or whatnot. So yeah, that's definitely a component of it. And it's also, I mean, the best way to think about it, I think, is thrownness is that aspect of the past, but not as a kind of static historical past, like some historical fact. It's the past that's still kind of pushing into this forward momentum towards possibilities. It's a living past. Very Briggsonian, by the way. Take
Sounded
that off my bingo card for today. Yeah.
We do. I just put it in chat. We need a Heidegger bingo card.
Oh, I didn't even see.
Boop and then
Yeah.
have it up.
But if what you're saying, Chase, about the relationship of the thrownness with death would seem to imply that when it comes to the individual person, that their possibilities are very much a part of the time or times that they were thrown in. Right. And so, I mean, one of you mentioned the word contingency, but it's not just the contingency of the accidents of you walking out the door and meeting someone who you're going to marry, but also just for lack of a better term, the historicalness of the time that you were born and are right maturing and the experiences you have.
Yeah. He's gonna. So another part that he gets into later when he talks about temporality is he talks a lot about history, but in a kind of few different conceptions of history. And one of those has to do, so, well, one thing you're saying about, okay, so we've got thrownness as this past that pushes you into a present towards a future, and the future that's about the possibilities, but the present is about fallenness. And that's where this kind of contingency of societal determinations comes into play, because that's what fallenness is. That, okay, we're thrown into a facticity, and that also includes this state of fallenness in which we're, in our everyday mode of being, inauthentic, or absorbed into we take as our own interpretations of our possibilities, the interpretations that are given by the public, they self, das Man. And so that's obviously going to be socially and historically determined to some degree, although he wants to also have a kind of authentic way of grasping that history, which I'm not exactly sure what he says about that. Although you can see maybe where some a little bit of Nazism comes in here with blood and soil and whatnot, where he wants to take a kind of authentic tradition of a people's history, and then he says, we need to grasp that in some way and bring that into our own possibilities. But I think that's not till quite a bit later in the book, somewhat. I don't know. Yeah. But yeah, it's all coming up, which is another thing I feel like I'm constantly saying.
It's all coming up. Sounds like you're about to puke or something.
Yeah,
Chase, pretty much am. I almost
But
did. Almost did this morning. I was quite hungover.
Oh, I
It
um,
was not fun. I think I'm okay now though. Like
yeah, but
8 hours later.
this idea of tying one's personal history into a people's history isn't necessarily just Nazi. I mean, that
So yeah,
Nazism didn't come from from the head of one demented person. I mean, there were many different individuals. I guess you could use the word authenticity, right? In many different European countries in the 1800s, and that's why you had so many publications of language dictionaries, the printing of oral stories into print for the first time, this kind of rediscovery of quote unquote national languages like Hungarian, Romanian, Bulgarian, and even to a certain extent German. So, I mean, it seems to me that there's a certain impoverishment in terms of the currents to just when Heidegger says something like this. And remember, he published this work in 1927. The Nazi Party was insignificant. It was, for anybody who knew about it, most of the people who knew about it, was a joke. And so it seems to me if it's he could be, even if he's not citing his influences, there's so much of of multiple intellectual traditions in the 1800s going into the 1900s that certain kinds of understanding the way that you're presenting Heidegger's ideas would be very much a part of.
yeah, I definitely think you're right. And so I've been watching this 6 hour explanation video of the film Midsummer. If anybody's seen it, it's pretty
Wait.
good.
You are hungover. You read Heidegger and then watched an explanation of Midsummer.
I've been watching it. It's kind of my so this is what I have kind of like different levels of things based off how my cognitive capacities at the time. So, it's strongest sort of afternoon, early evening. But if I'm doing
Right.
something I'm somewhat distracted, but I want to have something on, but I still have enough cognitive ability to not have it be completely mindless, then something like a film explanation video on YouTube will be something like that. But I'll do it over the course of a long time. So I'll watch, 10, 15 minutes here and there. So over the past week or so, I've been watching, yeah, an explanation of Midsummer, and the same YouTube channel had about a 5 hour one of Hereditary,
Oh,
uh,
that pissed me off.
which
Oh, that
also
made me so
also
angry. That
great.
could have been it could have been perfect, Chase, if it wasn't for the ending. It
You know
could
that
have been
what the
perfect.
ending is the best part.
No. Okay.
You d-
Agree to
oh, really?
disagree. Yes, because whatever. Go ahead. We'll discuss it off topic. I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's
A34.
well
When it
that
comes to Midsummer, I'm sorry, I got distracted. What was your how did that relate to this? I'm sorry.
yeah, so in Midsummer, there's a lot of going to the history of the certain traditional discourses that the either the Nazis or other kind of fascist organizations sort of took up and appropriated for their own use, including a lot of Norse mythology aspects. And it goes into a lot of the same thing. And so the thing is the kind of blood and soil aspect that you to some degree is you can see in these kind of pagan neo-pagan revivals going on in the 20th century or even somewhat before that too. um, you see how that component was taken up and appropriated by a lot of fascists to give a kind of special emphasis on territoriality and that aspect of it. And I think that's also somewhat, I mean, this is pretty speculative, but I think you can see that Heidegger does have a thing for groundedness, let's say. And the way that inauthenticity is explained as a kind of being ungrounded, or why not deterritorialization. And he very much wants territorialization in history and in the people and in the soil and the ground. But that's not necessarily fascist, I think, in itself. It's the same way that kind of people say that we're trying to revive aspects of traditional Nordic mythology into their religious understanding. They were doing that, and I think Heidegger almost had a sympathy for something more along that line. But like a lot of those groups, they got kind of sucked into the National Socialist fascist aspect of these discourses. They're not inherently like that, but you can see how this kind of romantic way of thinking about the ground, the people, the tradition, that, yeah.
Well, but I mean, that's one of the reasons why Tolkien was so. I don't want to make Tolkien sound like an idiot. So, I mean, obviously, he abhorred Nazism because of its ideology. But one of the reasons he was troubled was Nazism was tainting the Nordic Teutonic traditions, right? Mythologies, religions. And I mean, he wrote that something like when he was talking about the British, or I should say the English, to a certain extent Welsh, why do they view themselves as being somehow connected to the Greco-Roman world, whereas the Teutonic, the Germanic traditions don't seem to be part of the narrative of Englishness? And he said, the English language is Teutonic in origin, not Latin. And when you look at so many aspects of English history, you have to go back to, Germany, Scandinavia. And so he was troubled because he thought that there was a certain value in the study of these Teutonic pre-Christian traditions, even though he was a very committed Roman Catholic. And he was troubled because now, because of Nazism's appropriation of many aspects of this tradition, people would shy away from it and feel uncomfortable in dealing with it. And so again, there is a certain strain in multiple countries where the port cities are seen to be the ones that are most open to for lack of a better term, national influences. All right. They're more by definition cosmopolitan, right? And if one is trying to understand one's country, tradition, culture, is that getting in the way of that? Are those influences getting away? And if you look at different people in trying to create new polities, so many times you'll see the misappropriation of different models from representative governments to countries that just don't work. All right. And there's this sense of, what about some kind of blending of different governmental legal traditions to the lived reality on the ground, so that you might have had more stable government? I mean, I know I just brought in something new to what I'd been saying a couple minutes ago, but I mean, I don't consider Jefferson a fascist. And yet, if you look at some of Jefferson's writings, He talks about the importance of the yeoman farmer, right? The self-sustaining, making decisions, and that would be the basis for a robust citizenship. Because this person is making all these decisions constantly, and not just merely being a worker in somebody's shop in a city. And so he thought that there was something for representative government in people making decisions for themselves in an economy that would transfer to their abilities to be fully functioning citizens. And so, and this isn't the old Jefferson. This isn't the Jefferson after he leaves the White House and he gets quote unquote more conservative, but this was Jefferson much earlier in his life, where he's working through different ideas about representative government.
When we're talking about this thrownness, it brought to mind for me Sartre, and I'm wondering if this is one place where he departs from Heidegger, because again, I can't promise I understand Sartre correctly either, but from my reading, Sartre would say that there is facticity, which is stuff you can't do anything about. Like, I can't do anything about, what period of time I was born into, what the government is, who my parents are. I can't do anything about the laws of physics, and there's just stuff that I just can't control. It's just part of the way the world is. And and I'm assuming he gets a lot of this from Heidegger. He talked about abandonment. We are abandoned into this world. I think the one reason he uses that word is because he's explicitly counterposing his view to a theological view, like God puts us into the world. He's like, no, we're just abandoned here. We're just, and which I think is more or less like thrownness. But my reading of Sartre is that he says, yes, there is facticity, and there are facts about the world that you're born into, including your cultural context and so on, but you are not bound to act according to that, so that you can choose, you can actualize possibilities other than those that are handed to you by your social and political environment. And it seems to me like that's something Heidegger could say. I mean, I don't know why he couldn't. Because I thought part of the difference between Das Man and an authentic mode of living was exactly living toward your possibilities rather than merely living out the possibilities that are handed to you by your social and cultural context. But, maybe I'm wrong. I mean, does Heidegger deny that we have that kind of freedom to actualize possibilities other than those that are granted by our immediate traditions?
Thank you for bringing that up, Nevitt. When you were saying that, what I was thinking of is, what would be our possibilities? All of us, we've all been meeting in these Zoom seminars. What if all of a sudden, one of us snaps our fingers and we're in a hunting gathering society, I don't know, 7,000 years ago? No matter how, I think I'd probably be dead soon, but others of you might be a little bit better off. But what I mean is, the possibilities we would experience in a hunting gathering society, even if we could somehow transcend them, there would still be limits to the transcendence given you know what I'm trying to say? And so that's my sense of all of your descriptions and analysis of Heidegger, that yes, we can transcend, but that we can't ignore the actual lived environment that we're in, because that's still going to put certain, I defer to you all, constraints, limits to what our possibilities are.
Yeah, I think that's right. Because we've talked about before that any any mode of authenticity is actually I forgot the word, but a modification of inauthenticity. So it's like inauthenticity, the they, likewise, the they are kind of this, that's there always. And then authenticity is some kind of modification of that. But still in the modification, it's so I agree. I don't know what Sartre would say here. Frankly, I think Sartre's notion of freedom is a bit I'm not sure how realistic I think it is, but because he thinks we have this like absolute radical freedom, and I'm not sure that's true. But even if it's constrained, it seems like and again, maybe this is sort of a Hegelian point, the possibilities, there is a horizon of possibilities, there is a range of possibilities, but it seems like within that range, I wouldn't be bound to endorse, so like for example, take someone like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who is in Germany, in the mid 1940s, and most of the Christian church is just capitulating to Nazism and is endorsing Nazism. Most of primarily, I guess, the Lutheran church, the state churches, they're just saying, yep, this, kind of like, yep, Trump, he's a great guy. We Christians, yep, Trump's great. And just sort of capitulating in that same kind of way. But you have a few people, the confessing church, Dietrich Bonhoeffer and a few others who said, no, this is not what Christianity is about. So granted, the possibilities of his activity were constrained by the history of Christianity and his personal experience and his educational experiences. But nevertheless, he was able to actualize possibilities other than those that were demanded of him by his immediate environment and culture. So I guess even within those constraints, it seems like, and I don't know what Heidegger would say to that. I really don't know.
It would have to be pointed out at the same time, like his actions are still, they're not, they're maybe despite the prevailing trends of his immediate position in history, but they're not separated or to be decontextualized from his position. It's still through facticity that he's able to express some kind of authentic being. So I think the way you were kind of characterizing Sartre, and I'm not a big expert on Sartre, but I think this is kind of one of the characterizations, is that he kind of seems to conceive of freedom as this other to, this determined, law-like governed factual realm. It's freedom is other than facticity, where it seems like what Heidegger is saying here is that what we get in terms of authenticity is through through facticity, not taking flight from facticity.
Well, yeah, but although I don't think Sartre would say, we can't violate facticity. You can't negate facticity. I don't think Sartre would say you can. But I think what he would say is that you can reinterpret facticity. So you are free to interpret facticity in a way that can offer you new possibilities. But putting Sartre aside, I'm agreeing with what you're saying. So take someone like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the possibilities he had, so I'm agreeing, are still constrained by facticity. Namely, in his situation, his theological upbringing, the whole Christian tradition, the history of Christianity, the social interpretations of Christianity that were active in his time. But given there was a range of possibilities even within that domain of facticity, and he seemed to have the freedom to choose some rather than others. So he didn't have the freedom to somehow lift himself out of his historical context or out of facticity, but he did have a freedom to choose. And the way you guys were talking about Heidegger, it was sounding like, no, you in order for your life to have meaning, you have to embed it, you have to buy into some traditional historical narrative. And to me, that sounds like Das Man. It doesn't sound like Dasein activating possibilities.
I mean, I think he's also playing. I think Ed was indicating that earlier. There's some 19th century, you know, flotsam and jetsam floating around in the intellectual current about authentic selfhood, rooted in tradition, blood, and soil. And so I think this is one of the things that Heidegger is kind of availing himself of. But I wanted to say, like, when you were saying, when you kind of led and said maybe this is a kind of Hegelian point, I think kind of what we're in agreement here, that the idea of our facticity and our historicity is at once a limit on our possibilities, but also a precondition for any possibilities whatsoever. It's a positive condition, but at the same time a limit. I think is very kind of a Hegelian kind of take.
Yeah, I mean that's part of one of my confusions when Heidegger is saying things like talking about Dasein as possibility. Just that seems like nothing, because like you said, it seems like choice. You have to have things to choose, and so like you said, being in a particular context is a condition for the possibility of making choices. Because otherwise, if you just have like infinite possibility, that's like having no choice at all. I mean, there's nothing to choose. But anyway, I'm just not quite sure how this fits in with Heidegger's traditionalism. If, to what degree we're bound by this sort of traditionalism.
Yeah. So I think what Sartre is definitely taking a lot of what he's talking about in that existentialism is a humanism, and that abandonment and all that is he's definitely taking a lot about facticity and thrownness from Heidegger. I think they have pretty similar ideas about the role of how, facticity in one sense is a kind of, it's setting the parameters of possibilities, but it's also a condition. So you need that. There's no kind of absolute transcendent, freedom spirit flying around. Uh, and that's a pretty common thing for, I think, all these sort of existentialist phenomenologists, including, I would include Merleau-Ponty in there, probably Simone de Beauvoir as well. They all more or less have this idea. It seems like where they would disagree, I think especially this where the disagreement would be between Heidegger and Sartre would be the account of where that freedom is, where Sartre seems to say that it's kind of like it's subjectivity ultimately, and through its negating or annihilation or whatnot, that's what gives us freedom in some way. It's consciousness, where Heidegger is, he's constantly saying that consciousness or a certain idea of subjectivity is instead this kind of derivative thing. I think there is something like a authentically free subject for him, and that's this authentic Dasein. And I think that's also a component that is influencing Sartre, but I just think that the way they conceive of it is different in terms of Heidegger would say that Sartre he's still too Kantian. Well, not Kantian. I mean, well, maybe you'd say that, but I meant Cartesian. He's still too Cartesian, and that's because he's also very much like a lot of these other Merleau-Ponty, also still very much influenced by Husserl, probably even more so than Heidegger, even though they all, of course, were influenced by Heidegger in lots of ways, but they also still were like, we don't want to throw away Husserl. He's still extremely important. So I think there's a lot of kind of complex stuff going on there, but the other thing that I think differentiates Sartre and Heidegger would be okay. This is so I haven't read this part of Being in Time, and I'm basically going off of the synopsis from YouTube videos or random secondary sources and whatnot. Uh, one source in particular is actually uh Nevid it's Solomon. What was his first name?
Robert.
Yeah,
Robert.
yeah, Robert Solomon. But anyways, this is the way that I understand it is he's saying, um, okay, everyone is kind of, born into this fallenness and inauthenticity, but then you can have this authenticity by going through this modification that goes through the phenomena of anxiety and the call of conscience and whatnot. And from that, you're able to grasp your own most possibilities. And that's what's individuated. But then that corresponds with an idea about, well, what are your possibilities, especially in terms of the past in your history, because you are still Mitsein or being with others. So that is never something that is you never really transcend that aspect. Even when you're grasping your own most possibilities that are authentic, there's still possibilities that have to be conditioned through action in a social field, more or less, which is also historical. And I think the way that he thinks that you can grasp, once you're aware of this kind of existential freedom, authentic possibilities, then you can choose to take up also these elements of your historical culture. And that, I believe he calls it repetition, and has some idea about tradition with that. And I'm not exactly sure the details on it. I think part of it is that it's getting retrospectively read through his Nazism, and I've definitely basically been doing that now. It's hard to really determine like the differentiations there. But anyways, but that's where I think he is saying that we have to act even through this existential freedom, this authenticity, this in an own most way, still through this tradition that belongs to our blood and soil ultimately. And I think Ed is, he's talking about these you've got these historical influences that are also talking about the same thing, more or less, in terms of, well, you need to have this connection with, your social environment, your historical environment. And there's ideas about, a renovation of the people and the nation state and whatnot through this connection. And that's where either whether National Socialist or fascist, they're taking that idea and perverting it in a very specific way, or that doesn't characterize all these different traditions that are thinking the same way, but in a different way. But that's where I think Heidegger he's all swarming around in the ambivalence of these influences. And I think ultimately that's why he was seduced by Nazism. But once again, there's this danger of kind of like a retrospective interpretation of it all. And I don't know. I'm probably guilty of that. So, yeah, take what I say with a grain of salt, I guess.
It's also interesting in the fact that you know, the facticity does limit your possibilities, as Nevid and Eric said. And there is now whether or not you have infinite possibilities or what the limit is on the possibilities, that's I guess an argument I'm not well versed enough in Sartre or Heidegger to really even comment on. But but having truth as a phenomena of expression from the they self, again, even limited or not, the creativity aspect of your possibilities doesn't make your expression of Dasein arbitrary. It's your revealing of yourself in that time. And that makes it incredibly personable. And that individuation aspect of the dread of what you're missing from the finality of death. So
I guess I'm wondering though, to what degree so that seems to suggest that each individual Dasein has a kind of authentic essence that they can disclose. I'm not, I haven't got a sense from Heidegger that that's the case. I mean, he seems, you know, we are for the most part the they self. So I am mostly, I mean, I don't know, he probably wouldn't put it this way, but I'm mostly a social construct of my environment, something like that, of my social historical context. And that's mostly what I am. I'm not sure. I haven't, like I said, I haven't got any sense that he thinks I have any authentic essence as an individual human being that I am charged with disclosing in my activity or in the world. Am I wrong about that?
Well, okay, so I think he definitely thinks Dasein has an essence, and that has to do with disclosure. But then I guess the danger would be having too much of a kind of ontic individualism, where the essence is definitely operating on a ontological level. So,
Which means a non-individuated level, right?
well, it's kind of, it's okay. This would be something where it's kind of like the ontological is, like a transcendental condition that's, what is it, conditioning of ultimately existence, which is played out on an ontic level. So in a way, it's not fully reducible to ontic particularities, but it's it it necessarily has to be played out in that way, if that makes sense. Probably
I'm
doesn't.
going to go back and rewatch that because I really like the way you worded that. That was good.
Oh, thank you.
Sounds, I'll sort of give Eric another little shout out here. Sounds a bit Hegelian to me, like this, the dialectic between the universal and the individual. Sounds a bit like that, the way you're describing it. I hope I'm not going to ask Chase whether he does this or not because I don't want to put him on the spot again. But there's a couple more things in here that I hope he says more about. One is freedom. I hope he's because I don't really understand what the locus of freedom is or what freedom means or freedom in the individual and what is the individual. So all those questions. And then another one is conscience because he just barely mentions it. I mean, one thing I think Chase pointed this out. I think maybe Alistair pointed this out to you guys, and it certainly seems to be the case that Heidegger's methodology is he'll give an introduction in which he just covers a whole lot of stuff. He just throws a whole lot of stuff on the page, terms, concepts, ideas, and then he spends the next 100 pages explicating that. And so, sometimes he'll throw something out and it's like, what the hell does that mean? And then he ends up explaining it like 30 pages later. So I'm kind of hoping that's what he's going to do with conscience, because, he, see, where was it? Said something about conscience in here, and I was like, I don't get that.
Yeah, that's the next chapter after this. So this one is on death possibilities, and then the next one, which is Dasein's attestation. Did I pronounce that right? Attestation of an authentic potentiality for being and resoluteness. So that's going to go into the call of conscience
Okay,
thing.
good.
So he'll definitely go into details about that. And he'll talk more about freedom in the later parts of this chapter on death.
Good.
Although I have to say I don't quite understand his exactly what he's saying about freedom.
And how are you going to explain it to us?
Yeah, exactly. I don't know. These are the things I worry about. Yeah, I don't know. I think I probably read too much Spinoza, so a lot of ideas about freedom I'm always kind of like, I don't know. Uh including like Sartre's idea. I think maybe when I had a somewhat of a preliminary idea about that maybe, and now I could be like, it seems to like not make any sense at all the way I try to uh recompose it in my head now. So, and somewhat the same thing with Heidegger, where although I feel like I'd never really understood Heidegger's thing about freedom, is he doesn't. I think one reason is because I just haven't read that part of it, because I think he goes into that more with the stuff about temporality, I think. Um, but also I feel like because he doesn't emphasize it as much, obviously, as somebody like Sartre. Um, I think that also is why it's somewhat so it's more marginal, and I'm just not really sure what's going on exactly with the freedom thing. So hopefully we'll
Well,
find, and I'll be able to say something about it, and hopefully y'all will continue to take everything I say with a grain of salt, please. Because I'm I'm just doing the best I can, and it's probably hopefully it helps, but yeah.
well, you have in past discussions clarified things for me, certain things a whole lot, and actually redirected some of my misinterpretations. I've had a few things there where I was like way off, and then you very, very diplomatically explained to me that I was way off. So yeah, you've saved me from some hermeneutical faux pas several times. So I do appreciate that.
Yeah, second there, Chase. Like, this is not an easy text to read, and I feel like
No, it's
your input
definitely
has
not.
been really helpful in forming ideas. So thank you. Like, your best isn't like, I think you're in the right field. You'll be an excellent teacher. You really will.
Thank you.
I was going to say maybe a little bit in Heidegger's defense, if he doesn't give us a really clear, well, or the kind of explanation of freedom that we would want. If again if he's really is trying to develop an ontology, he's not. The notion of how freedom works out in an individual expression of one's life is probably not his real concern, whereas Sartre is. So like in the letter on humanism, Sartre gives a very concrete example of a young man trying to decide whether to join the resistance or stay home and take care of his mother. And so Sartre is he's very concerned with how you make actual real decisions in the world, and how where does freedom enter in there? Whereas Heidegger is not interested in that. He's interested in ontology. So maybe I should forgive him for not giving that the kind of explanation I want. finish your fucking thesis, to quote Alistair.
Yeah. I feel like that's definitely a possibility towards death. It's definitely there's definitely orientations of death, and uh in this case I would say merely possibilities going on at this point. So we'll see. It's within my hopefully within my rate my facticity to be able to have that possibility of finishing it, but I don't know. Maybe I can only finish it after I'm dead.
You don't have
I don't
kids,
need all
you're
of you
dead.
collectively to go through my hundreds of pages of Google Notes and finish it for me.
No, what you need to do is you need to have children, and then they will finish it for you. So you better get busy.
I'll work on that.
Remember, desire is fecundity, the despotic signifier.
Anybody got a sister? They're never mind. Never mind. They're,
Uh,
I do, but she's already married, and
uh, or maybe
so
a daughter, somebody within breeding range of age. Like I'm just trying to get it.
now who's
Editor.
now who's sounding like blood and soil now?
Yeah,
Breeding
yeah.
range.
I mean, I think I'm actually thinking of this somewhat too because of that Midsummer video. Because yeah, it's all about got the breeding and whatnot going on there too.
Yeah, get those birthing hips in gear.
Amen.
I love our intellectual conversation during these.
I gave you a link for a Chinese bride's website. So
Oh, excellent, excellent.
Also, do not ignore Kazakhstan. Yeah, I mean there's women who want to get out of that country. So
I actually, one of my ex-girlfriends was a orphan from Kazakhstan.
no, really. I mean, I'm
Yep.
not letting she was orphan. I feel badly about